Everyone, I'm Matt Kroll, the Planning Services Division Manager here at Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development, and I'll be facilitating this meeting today. So I want to start off though, actually, before we get into the main part of the meeting, this is kind of special for us here at DLCD because we have our new regional representative, Nicole Mardell, with us, and probably fairly early in her time here. And I wanted to make sure that she has a chance to introduce herself because I don't know if she's met all of you yet. Hopefully some of them, but maybe not all of them.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Mardell. I'm your new Mid-Willamette Valley Regional Representative. I've been on board now for just over 2 weeks, so I'm still kind of getting a bearing on things. But if I haven't met you already, I'll be reaching out to schedule a virtual meeting to understand some of the key issues going on in this region. And I look forward to working with all of you. Thanks, Matt.
All right. Well, so this is what our meeting today is going to look like this afternoon. We're starting with here some welcome introductions, and I want to go around and have all of the local staff have a chance to introduce themselves so that we know who we've got here. I think we'll have the DLCD staff and ODOT as you come up with your presentation, jump in at that time and introduce yourself. And then you can see on the list here several of the different topics we want to tackle as we move through that. We will be starting with an overview also, just to cover, hopefully this is not new to anybody here what we're doing here, but just a good reminder of why we're doing this and some of the urgency and the real importance that we're making with these rulemaking. So for the introductions, what I'd like to do is give a chance for everyone here who's from local staff to let us know your name, what organization you're with, and then maybe give us on a scale of like 1 to 5, how familiar you are with these current rules as we are right now, or the draft that we're working on. You know, 5 would be, I know the rules, I don't need any presentation, I want to jump straight into discussion because I have things to tell you about the rule. And then 1 would be, I'm not even sure what all topics are covered in this rule, still trying to get an overall scope, and just hear from everybody where you think you fall somewhere in that scale. If people want to volunteer to introduce themselves, we can do that.
I'll go first.
Please.
So Julie Warnicki, I'm with the City of Salem Public Works Department, Transportation Planning Manager. I am on the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, so therefore I should probably say that I'm a 5. However, I would probably say that I'm a 4, and even that doesn't mean that I actually understand. I think the more you get into them, the more complexities that are maybe not clear. So I definitely understand the intentions. I just don't know that I understand all of how the rules actually work together with each other.
Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, I was going to let Eunice go next, but so Mike Jaffe, I'm the Transportation Planning Manager with the Salem Keizer MPO. Probably around 2 is a good number. I mean, I haven't been following it super closely, but I have read a few of the packets, watched 1 or 2 of the RAC meetings. But like Julie, this is very complex. It takes a lot to go through every rule and then kind of in your mind map all the connections. And I'm
Ray
gonna,
Jackson.
yes.
Ray Jackson, SCAT staff. I was going to say I was a 4 on the scale, but if Julie's a 4, I should really say I'm a 3, just to, you know, I don't follow it all that closely. But I do appreciate the minutes and the amount of work that you guys are putting into this. So thank you.
I'm Eunice Kim, Long Range Planning Manager for the City of Salem. I'm going to say a 3 since Julie said a 4.
I'm Kim Sepp, and I'm also on the staff at the COG and SCATs, about a 2.
Go ahead, Shane.
Hey, sorry guys, I was having some technical difficulties. Shane Witham, City of Keizer Planning Director. I'm here, just a little late.
Hey, Shane, if you wouldn't mind just saying on a scale of like 1 to 5, what's your familiarity with our current draft? 5 would be you know it, you're ready to start jumping straight into discussion, and 1 is you're not even sure what all is covered on it, neither broad.
Matt, I really don't want to answer that. I'm on the
Okay.
Rules Advisory Committee, and I feel like I should be able to say I'm a 5, but I think that, you know, I haven't looked at the list of who all's here, but I may be the most unintelligent person in the room.
Nah.
So I would say my familiarity probably hovers closer to a 3 to a 4 than where it should be, considering I'm part of the Rules Advisory Committee. So I apologize. It's just some of it's a little difficult for me.
And we're not laughing. We're laughing here because that was almost exactly what Julie said when she introduced herself on the
Well,
committee.
if Julie said it, that's great, because I know she's way smarter than me.
So
Now, I said I should be a 5, but I'm only a 4.
If Julie's a 4, I'm probably like a 2 then. So I
hey, Brandon, are you available?
Hi, Brandon Wright, Marion County Building and Planning Division Manager. And I'll just be the 1, so others can be above me then, 2s and 3s and 4s.
Because Brandon, we are always above you.
I've read the rules, you know, I've gone through them
I'm
and this will
joking.
apply to the county and all that, but
That gives you points.
All right. As I'm looking down the list, I think that's everyone from our local staff. But if I missed anyone, jump in. So I think then I will turn it over to Evan to talk about a little overview on this.
Thanks, Matt. Evan Manville, Land Use and Transportation Planner, he, him. Just a first chart, kind of when we're asking for local jurisdictions to act in the current draft. You can see your jurisdictions over there and kind of what year we would expect you to do certain things. CFA stands for Climate Friendly Area Designation, HNA, obviously Housing Needs Analysis. So those are those, that's kind of, okay, some of this stuff is going to happen soon. Some of it's going to happen as you update your TSPs, but giving you a sense of your work schedule. Next slide. Yeah, so some of those details will come out in the subject areas. So just the why, we do want to center this conversation and remind ourselves that we're doing significant rulemaking. That's a significant change for a reason. And that's because we're totally missing to meet our climate pollution reduction goals. On our current trajectory, we're going to have 4 times as much transportation pollution as our plans by 2050. So we're, you know, that has all sorts of impacts. We're already feeling the impacts of climate disruption on Oregonians, and it's really painful. So we need to change significantly. Next slide. The other driver of this is inequity. This is the climate friendly and equitable communities. We have a long history of racism and problems with inequity, and that passes on from generation to generation. Those who were discriminated against are feeling the intergenerational challenges of that because they didn't inherit home wealth, which is the main way that wealth is passed from generation to generation. So people today, Black households today, that it's a bigger gap between white and Black household home ownership than 30 years ago. So we got a lot of work to do on equity. And that's just one example on the challenge there. Next slide. The other thing is kind of a more positive thing. It's just saying, hey, what our past plans have planned for is not the reality today. Households are totally different. The nuclear family, half as many households as 40 years ago, 50 years ago, are nuclear family households. Twice as much are single person households. About 1/3 of all households are single person households. So the sort of households we need to plan for has changed a lot and will continue to change. You kind of see that bright red line going upwards. That's single person into the future. So we got a lot of reasons to change how we're planning. Next slide. So the governor ordered us to act aggressively on climate and try to redirect that chart that's headed in the wrong direction, or at least the right direction, way too slowly. And us and a bunch of other state agencies to exercise any and all authority and discretion to bend that curve down to where we need to be for the health of the planet and our communities. In that order, the climate executive order she issued, she also directed us to prioritize equity and focus on historically marginalized communities and underserved populations. So you see other agencies doing a lot of work under this executive order. DEQ particularly has been in the news, but our role is there very much because transportation pollution is the leading source of climate pollution in Oregon, and land use and transportation planning has a big impact on that. Next slide. What we're aiming for is something that we already have a lot of in Oregon. It's fabulous places that you can get around without needing to get in your car. This is McMinnville's downtown. People come from all over the region to enjoy it. People can live there and work there and run their errands there without having to get into a car. And so what we're hoping for, and what is in our vision and our models, is saying about a third of households live in a place like this, about 30%. And if we can get a third of households to live in areas like that and do a bunch of other things, we can actually meet our pollution reduction goals. So there's a real positive thing, and we're not saying everyone needs to live in a place like this, but we have some of those places. We just need more of them, is what we're hoping for. Next slide. The rulemaking just applies to 8 metro areas, which is about 2/3 of the population. So it's really focusing on the places where transportation choices can work better. And that's why you all are here. Obviously, Portland Metro is the big one, but these other places all have over 50,000 folks. So those jurisdictions, both the cities and the counties who have land in the urban growth boundaries, are impacted in these areas. But everywhere else outside of that, this rulemaking is not part of what we're addressing. Next slide. Process-wise, we've engaged a healthy rulemaking advisory committee. Thank you, Shane and Julie, particularly, for serving on that, and everyone else. We have representatives from those 8 regions, and we also really worked to have a RAC that reflects the diversity of Oregonians. Many more people of color, people with disabilities, renters, people representing just perspectives that are usually shut out of the public process for various reasons. We really worked to try to get a rulemaking advisory committee where those voices were in the room and at the table and advising us, particularly because equity is a driving force of this rulemaking. So it's been a really engaged, thoughtful advisory committee that is teaching us all sorts of things and helping us as we go through. We've had 9 advisory committees thus far. We'll have 2 or 3 more before the rules are hopefully adopted in May. Next slide. Last slide for me. The commission, when they were responding to the governor's order, directed the department to take action in kind of 2 channels. The first is regional planning, doing things like Metro did with its climate smart communities, of creating a regional plan of all the specific actions they want. And Cody will talk about this more, so I will stop, and develop that regional plan to meet the pollution reduction needed in the region. The second is to take action on 6 issue areas, and they're listed below, and we'll briefly go into them as we go. Climate friendly areas, the things like McMinnville's downtown, parking management, electric vehicle charging, improving transportation choices so people actually do have options to get around, thinking about how we select transportation projects, and thinking about how congestion standards play into that puzzle. So with that, I think I will turn it to Cody.
I'm going to just step in for a second and go back for one moment because I realize I owe an apology. I think in looking at the list, I missed Vic Lippert was on the list and didn't give a chance to introduce. And we've had two other people show up. So we can just go back to introductions for just a moment so we know who's here. Vic? If you're willing to, if not. Steve?
I'm Steve Dickey. I'm the Director of Technology and Program Management for Salem Area Mass Transit District.
And Janelle joined us.
Hi, I'm Janelle Shanahan. I was having trouble unmuting, sorry. Transportation planner with Marion County.
Oh, thanks. Welcome. All right, thanks for that brief interruption. Then we will go back to Cody, who's going to talk about regional scenario planning.
Thanks, Matt. Good evening, everyone. Almost evening, I suppose. Cody Meyer, Land Use Transportation Planner with DLCD. And I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the draft rules here for the regional scenario planning. As Evan mentioned, we've had these rules for about a decade now. We've had a requirement for Metro to do the planning and have a voluntary process for the other metropolitan areas in the state. And so our commission gave us a charge that they wanted to have more scenario planning going forward, and that Eugene Springfield, since they did some scenario planning with conjunction of a legislative mandate to identify a scenario that might achieve the greenhouse gas targets, but not adopt it. They're really poised to kind of use that scenario to go forward and adopt that and make the local changes they need to stand it up. And then for Salem Keizer area to begin this process. So we do have greenhouse gas reduction targets in our Division 44 is that kind of chapter of rule that we have for this. And it's for household travel. So it really covers the households that reside in a metropolitan area. So I-5, I drive up I-5 through your boundary, that doesn't count. If you live in the Salem Keizer region, that's the kind of travel we're talking about. They are set to work with the expected policy changes from the federal government and the state government on EV changes in the future, cleaner fuels. The statewide transportation strategy has a number of things that have been identified. And so really it's looking at the actions that local governments are responsible for, and that's vehicle miles traveled primarily. So just like a quick snapshot here, I know that I've talked to a number of you about this, but the overall framework is you kind of, and this really is what's in our rules. It is establishing how the jurisdictions want to work together. Is this something you want to do through the MPO and a regional process there? Is it something an IGA? This is how we're going to work together and make decisions. We've set up rules to come up with a work plan as the first step towards this for the Salem, Keizer, and Eugene, Springfield areas. And then you kind of get into the process here. And so the first step inside the process is what evaluation criteria. Greenhouse gases is important, but there's other things we call co-benefits that are also important. So there's different regional goals that you can look at. How do we know when we got there? What's a good scenario to pick? There's lots of options. So how are we going to select through these different alternatives? Gathering the data, developing and evaluating base year reference case data. That's something that we had talked with Salem, Keizer, I think jurisdictions both, and kind of realized that we needed to maybe speed up some of that data gathering with the state. I should back up and say the state is going to be supporting all this. So we do have something in there that says that that's the first thing to be delivered is that baseline information. Where are the adopted plans in the region today towards achieving the different outcomes? And so that's kind of the first step in the scenario planning. Then you really go into looking at alternatives. Here are some what ifs. What if you put all your money in transit? What if you put a quarter of your money in transit? What if you didn't have transit? Whatever questions you want to ask, and you're really pulling policy levers there. Then really working together to select a preferred scenario and then implementing that and monitoring it. And then the next slide will kind of expand on that last box there, is that the scenario planning is more or less a one-off effort, and the ongoing work is the implementation and monitoring. So we don't expect all of this to happen overnight. In Metro, the way this has worked is that they implement and monitor through their regional transportation plan. And inside the draft rules, that is a flexible, come to the commission, this is what we intend to do. Here's how we want to implement and monitor. Here's some performance measures we'd like to use to show that we're on track to meet the greenhouse gas reduction targets. So this is very similar to the work we've put inside the TPR rule language for performance monitoring, is that really on a 4 to 5 year planning cycle, we want this to be pretty consistent with the regional transportation plans because a lot of this information will be coming from there, a lot of the inventory data and whatnot. But to basically identify the gaps between the adopted plans today and performance targets, and then what corrective actions are necessary, what work needs to happen, update the plans or policies over the 4 or 5 years, and then make that happen. Then go back and you're really looking for course correction. Not enough, too much maybe, back off. Here's just a process to show us where we need to put our work to make these targets. So I think I'll just kind of stop there and open it up to the floor. I think we've kind of carved out about 10 minutes for each of these agenda items to gather questions and just have some deeper discussion.
Yeah, so I'd invite anybody who has some questions. You can either use the raise hand feature or just wave at me, or if there's an awkward silence, jump in and start talking. And maybe I'll just put one question out there that I'd be curious to hear, since we have a lot of people from the Salem, Keizer, various jurisdictions. Have you all had a chance to start talking together about what a work plan would look like and about what the schedule might be and figuring out how to align this with the various? And then anything else you'd want to bring up?
Well, I guess I will just jump in and say, no, we haven't really had a chance to talk. We have talked, but nothing as concrete as a work plan or a schedule or anything like that. We've been really trying to understand the rules as they've been evolving and, provide some input and reality to them. I guess I have a couple of questions that come to mind. And one relates to what Cody was just talking about with the monitoring through the regional planning effort, which implies that the MPO is going to somehow be involved in the ongoing monitoring of this. Through our Salem process, we've been doing quite a lot of work with our partners at the Council of Governments and using the model to look at different scenarios and to analyze different effects. And bottom line is that the tool that is used for SCATs, for transportation modeling, is not very responsive to some of the types of changes that I think are probably being envisioned. And so it's my understanding from assertions that I've heard in these meetings that the state's tool is more responsive to those things. And yet you said the state's scenario planning thing is a one-off. So how are we going to what is the mechanism then for monitoring going forward when we don't have a tool to use?
So to clarify, the monitoring is set up to be performance measures. So you wanted to get X amount of miles of bike lane built. So we're not really running those tools, and unless that's something you want to do the modeling tool for the performance monitoring. So that's really based on inventory data. What are the performance measures that you've adopted? Metro, their performance reports don't include a calculation of the greenhouse gas target. We said that to get to our goal, we will have to have this many more people living near transit, this many more miles of transit level service per capita. There are different kind of implementation actions that need to take place over the plan horizon here.
Okay. And then I guess my other, sort of general question that I believe might have come up at the LCDC meeting or work session that you guys had recently is, really, why do we need to do this scenario planning when we're being required to do a lot of things through the TPR that are in many ways similar, overlapping with what would likely come out of scenario planning? It seems to me, and I think maybe some other people, that focusing on implementing the TPR requirements initially and seeing how those work might be a better use of our limited resources. I wasn't able to listen to the LCDC meeting, so I don't know, exactly how that was addressed, but just curious if you guys have stepped back and thought about this some more.
I think the benefits for your area in particular is that it gives you more flexibility and more resources to get those TPR requirements set up and implemented. You really have the ability to look regionally and ask questions of what if this does not happen? What about doing some resiliency testing and really focusing in on developing the performance measures and targets that you want that fits your region the best, and that gets as many multiple outcomes as you can get. You really have to stretch your dollars, right? We all don't have as much money as we need to get things done, but it really provides, I think, a little bit more breathing room for you to get that work done. I agree with you that some of it will be very similar, and we have been working with City of Salem staff and talking about, our Salem and how can we accommodate the draft rules to the process in which the city's going forward with. And it feels like we have done some thinking and looking at kind of a phased approach to maybe get these things so they're not duplicative. No one wants to see that, and to get them kind of in a unified effort going forward. And that this really could set you up, I think, pretty nicely to have that room to get these things kind of figured out. And of course, transportation and housing, those are all regional issues. And we would really like to see more cities work together regionally. And this is one of the ways that the commission has been talking about making that happen.
So I'll let other people chime in. I have one more question, but I will pause for now.
So Cody, this is Steve Dickey. I'm only going to be able to be here till 5 because I do have a prior commitment, but just as we look at the ability for this to be successful and going forward, I am encouraged by the direction I've seen the City of Salem going with our Salem project and the efforts that are taking place there. I do hope, though, that as these efforts are carrying forward, like Julie said, so we have the TPR changes, now we have the scenario planning changes. Coordinating all of this is going to be essential, as is the on-the-ground application of it. And I'm thinking from a transit perspective right now, as we look at future development and growth of our communities, how we do that can have a significant impact on the ability for transit to be able to be an effective part of this solution. And as we see housing development and employment opportunities, looking for ways to help those be more consolidated rather than spread out and to be centralized. But also another element of this conversation is, it's in one element, especially when you're talking about municipalities, it's frequently an emphasis on infrastructure development and growth. And with transit, there is a certain element of that as well. But for both of us, there's also the ongoing ability to maintain and support that infrastructure. And in the transit world, it's also having that ongoing operational support to be able to provide that level of service that's necessary to to meet the needs. There is a lot of talk and support, which we much appreciate, about the need for improved frequency of transit and coverage of transit to make it a more viable option for people to naturally gravitate to, so that they will choose to not drive. But that also means we have to have the resources to be able to operate a more robust transit system to rise to that level of service. So that's something that, as we go forward, that's going to have to be part of this overall picture, is how do we make sure that the resources are there to support the level of service that we need. And just as an aside, also, just from an infrastructure standpoint, we are beginning to really put a much higher emphasis on our fleet being zero emission, and transitioning out all of our diesel fleet, and even transitioning some of our natural gas fleet over to battery electric. So that is something that is also part of our overall plan. But that's what I wanted to share.
Thanks, Steve. I guess one more to maybe think of, one of the benefits of the scenario planning is that you have these GHG reduction targets. When cities go above and beyond, such as Steve's mentioning, hey, we're going to transition to cleaner fleets, when our rules are flexible to say you have a target, but you can lower the target by doing things that go above and beyond what the state and the federal government are doing on vehicle and fuels. So an example is Rogue Valley did some work capturing methane from their landfill and powering buses and garbage trucks. And so that's above and beyond. And those are the kind of things that you can be a little bit more creative in achieving the target than what the TPR VMT targets would allow for.
Yeah, our CNG fleet right now is exclusively utilizing RNG, renewable natural gas, much like what our RBTD is doing.
Mike, did you have a comment or?
Well, I want to go back to Julie's question, because I was to this afternoon, I was looking at the scenario planning and reporting, and then she brought up the TPR reporting. So it's just fresh in my memory about TPR reporting. And it does seem strange to me that, down the road, you'll want both Salem Keizer to do the scenario planning reporting on progress and measures, and the TPR section has its own reporting. And I'm still confused, Cody, about is that the intention long term, or
Let's give them a sneak preview.
Yeah, is there something, trying to get the order of this is confusing. And so you asked Matt, have we had discussions? We're not even sure how these rules work. So until we kind of have a better idea of how the rules work, how can we discuss a game plan?
Yeah, so the answer to that question is pretty simple, is that we are removing all the requirements on reporting from Division 44, because we've been standing those up in Division 12 now in the TPR requirement. So basically that was such an old draft that came out back in March that's where we started building the reporting. And then we realized, you know what, this just makes more sense to put it in the TPR. And so you'll see this next, it'll be the same rules basically that come out that just point to, if you have a scenario plan, report on that performance measures you brought in with the scenario plan instead of the ones that are identified in the TPR reporting. So it's all one reporting.
So is there anytime you see that Salem's going to do both the TPR reporting and the scenario planning reporting?
They are one and the same. If you do a scenario plan, that is the TPR, says you will report on performance towards the scenario plan. If you don't have a scenario plan, there's a default set of performance measures. So it really is it allows more flexibility, essentially. It says if you do scenario planning, you have some flexibility to tell us how you want to report and use that.
Okay, and do the timelines work as well, as far as when they have to start doing reporting and when they have to submit this long-term scenario plan?
Yeah, that's certainly something we're going to make sure that those make sense for implementation.
But again, the regional scenario plan gives you that flexibility. So as part of coming up, when you work together on a work plan, figure out when you're going to have the regional scenario plan done, and then tell us what the reporting schedule makes sense. I mean, we've had some internal discussions. Does it make sense to report right after an RTP is done because you've got lots of fresh data? Or does it make sense to report 2 years before an RTP update so that you have that data ready to use in the RTP? That's a point of flexibility.
Yeah, although you're talking about the update of the RTP, and the RTP doesn't report on the types of things that I think you're thinking of. I mean, it's almost like they're totally separate.
Then you don't have to tie it to that then. That's fine.
Yeah.
So, hey, Matt, when you say RTP, do you mean the federally, would be the federal MPO RTP, or the RTP that was written in the rules that you guys are doing? You guys seem to have a similar acronym that might be confusing people at some point, or is that an RTS?
No, I mean the federal.
The federal, okay.
And so I think the default requirement is that cities report 1 year after the RTP is adopted, because hopefully the cities have the data then. But through a regional scenario planning process, you all come together and tell us that's not the way we want to report. We want to report on this schedule instead.
Well, and I guess that connection was why I was assuming that there was a link in with the transportation demand, travel demand model that is run by the region, as opposed to other stuff. And if it's other stuff, then I mean, you know, it's really not tied to the RTP unless we choose to make it tied to that, I guess, which would then involve sort of an agreement, you know, workflow agreement, which, you know, I think Metro probably has more, I don't know, they do more work on that type of stuff associated with their, you know, land use authority.
I think the way I put it is that we would want to encourage more regional work and consolidating, gathering data and whatnot, if that works for folks, but we're not requiring it. So we'd like to see those things. Kind of a lot of the data probably will have some TAZ based information. So we want to make sure we're getting the most current updated TAZ layers and, you know, those kind of things that are usually gathered on updates to RTPs, but it's certainly not required.
Eunice, I saw, did you have something you wanted to say?
Oh, I'm not sure if this fits in here or later. I think one of the challenges for Salem in particular is that it's one of our city's priorities is to update our transportation system plan. That is what we're hoping to start next year after our Salem is hopefully complete. And I think as the draft rules are written, there's not a requirement in terms of timelines for updating TSPs, but again, it's something that we locally want to do, which kicks in all of these requirements in the draft rules. And I think one of the challenges is that we want to do that, which kicks in all these rules. But it's at the same time that this regional scenario planning is going to be mandated. And so maybe it almost seems like we would be better off not doing the TSP next and just focusing on the regional scenario planning from kind of the timeline at the state level. But I think locally, that's not really, we know we need to make updates to our TSP and the infrastructure is really kind of the missing piece after we kind of do some of the rankings through our Salem. And so I think that's kind of where our struggle locally is.
Well, and politically, I mean, you know, politically, there's a strong desire to update the TSP, and I've tried to float, you know, the idea of maybe we could, you know, sell, you know, the regional scenario planning as the first step in updating our TSP. And the pushback I get internally is pretty much like, yeah, no, you know, it's just delay upon delay upon delay. And so just do it.
I don't think we want to try to tell you to delay your TSP update. I don't think that's
well, you know, and so anyway, it puts us in a really bad position. Because I know that you have indicated that not you particularly, but the LCD has indicated that there will be support for doing the regional scenario planning. And I get that, except for that support is going to look to the very few staff people to provide a lot of input to, you know, at least fact check what gets put out there. And so, So anyway, that's a lot of our concern.
I think we've been meeting and trying to work through this. And so I think maybe for the sake of time, we should continue to do that. It feels to me in thinking through it that we might be able to reconcile them by having more phased approach to the whole scenario planning that includes a TSP update in between, or at least some adoptable milestones, large adoptable milestones of your TSP. Climate friendly areas, getting those as the first piece in there. There's going to be a lot of work putting that together regardless. And so I think that we'll just continue to work through that and make sure that this is workable.
I think, yeah, we're gonna need to flag that for some follow-up and work on some of the other topics here. And if some of these other topics don't have as much discussion, we can come back to this at the end, but I do want to move to our next topic. If I can get the slide back here. So this is just a restatement of the key areas in the rest of the rules. And we will jump right into climate friendly area basics and hand it over to Kevin.
Hello, good afternoon, evening. I'm Kevin Young. I'm Senior Urban Planner with DLCD. One of the project managers for this effort. Also, I've been working quite a bit on the standards for climate friendly areas. I know some of you have heard this already, but I just want to make sure we all kind of have a shared basic understanding of what is a climate friendly area. Basically a walkable mixed use area that allows a combination of uses: residential, office, retail, services, and public uses. The reason these are important is they will allow people to get around without being reliant on single occupant vehicle trips. The areas need to be planned to accommodate at least 30% of housing needs for cities with population, or cities and county areas within UGBs, urbanized county areas within urban growth boundaries with a population above 10,000. And I'll talk a little bit more about that 30% a little later. The areas will need to be provided with high quality pedestrian bicycle transit services, so good alternative transportation options. Parking management is required in these areas. It's a component of our requirements for climate friendly areas. The draft rules that we currently have allow abutting high density residential or employment areas to be included. Even though they're not mixed use areas, they contribute to the fundamental mixed use core area. And then the local governments under the current draft would be allowed to choose between prescriptive or outcome-based standards, which I think is the subject of the next slide. Go ahead, Matt, if you could. There we go. Okay, so this chart just shows you, and I'm not going to go into detail here, but essentially the blue area there are the prescriptive standards, the orange area, the outcome-oriented standards, and they're both basically sized based on population. So from the smallest local governments, 5,000, population of between 5 and 10,000. Then we go from 10 to 25, 25 to 50 and above. And the requirements scale up from there. So as you can see, for prescriptive standards, we're interested in establishing minimum residential densities and a maximum building height. So this is not a required building height. It is, you must allow buildings up to this height in these areas. So that is essentially the package of prescriptive standards that a local government could adopt. Alternatively, they could adopt outcome-oriented standards. So they may have existing standards that they feel would achieve the goals that we're looking for. And basically, we would just ask the local government to demonstrate that that package of standards is sufficient to achieve the target intensity levels that are outlined here. So for the smallest communities, 20 homes and jobs per net acre is what we're looking for, and that just scales up as the cities grow in size. So these would be what we'd be looking for in the climate friendly areas. Next slide, please. In terms of implementation, the timelines are as follows. So local governments would be asked first to designate climate friendly areas by June 30 of 2023. So a little over a year after the rules would be adopted, we'd be asking local governments to say, hey, these are the areas we're thinking we will designate as climate friendly areas. And some associated analysis of equitable housing outcomes. The thing that we're most concerned about here is potential for displacement and displacement of underserved populations. And so that will require some demographic analysis of the areas that are proposed as climate-friendly areas, as well as identification of mitigation actions that the local government would take to avoid displacement that could occur. The next requirement is for, oops, I'm sorry, not ready for the next slide yet. Thank you. The next requirement is to adopt the zoning and comprehensive plan amendments. So an additional year is allowed for the local governments to develop those zoning standards, either through the prescriptive path or for the outcome-oriented path, and associated comprehensive plan amendments by June 30th, 2024. Also associated with the CFA zoning is a transportation review process. This is an alternative to the significant effect standard in 0060 of the TPR, the current standard, which requires that kind of automobile traffic oriented analysis. This one analyzes gaps for various transportation modes and asks local governments to plan to fill those gaps for pedestrian, bicycle, transit service in those areas, in these climate friendly areas. In some limited circumstances, there would be a requirement for highway impacts where we're close to, say, a intersection that impacts a state highway. But for the most part, not so much. Next slide, please. And then there are some associated changes to the housing rules. So if you're familiar with housing production strategy requirements, which came out of House Bill 2003, the proposed rules would basically, as part of that housing production strategy reporting, would require the cities with a population over 10,000 to monitor and report on housing production in climate-friendly areas, including affordable housing production, to identify strategies that can be used to facilitate housing production in those areas as well. And then lastly, beginning June 30th, 2027, urban growth boundary expansions that are based on residential needs would trigger additional climate-friendly area designation. And this is challenging to explain, but it would not necessarily require those climate-friendly areas to be in the areas of UGB expansion. Could be anywhere in the city. And the climate-friendly area designation needs to be sufficiently sized to accommodate half of the additional residential need. That is based on anticipated building envelopes, so kind of your build out scenario, not based on past production trends, which is typically the way HNAs or housing needs analyses work these days. There's a lot of information I just provided. I think that's my last slide. So do I have another one?
Nope.
No. Okay. So I think at this point, if there are questions or comments, I'm happy to field those.
And I would be interested to hear from any of the local staff if you've had a chance to think about these areas and maybe look at a map and you're like, I've got an idea where a CFA might be, or if you've had a chance to look at your development code and say, yeah, I think we're way up off, or we're pretty close, or how big a difference is there between what these rules are specifying, what you already have, or maybe you haven't had a chance to look at that yet.
Now, I'll say, this was one of the things we talked about the CFAs, I think at our last RAC meeting in one of the breakout rooms. And, in Keizer, super built out community, a lot of houses on the ground already. We did some planning work in our River Cherry Overlay District, rezoned everything to mixed use, with a focus on trying to figure out how when redevelopment happens, it becomes, really more in line with a lot of this stuff that we're talking about. Well, one of the concerns that I had raised is I think looking at those, it seems that the CFA designation, I'm not sure I could really use River Road as an example because it's a fairly narrow corridor. So that's something that for me, just as I have looked at some maps and I haven't, to be fair, I have not done in-depth analysis by any means, but I don't have a downtown core that I can point to that's kind of square and meets those distance requirements. So that's part of the challenge, I guess, for Keizer specifically, is trying to figure out, okay, well, where really would this fit? Or, you know, scenario plan, do I just say, climate friendly areas are all in Salem? Which, you know, I don't think that's fair or right. But anyway, so that just my 2 cents. I know that was one of the things that I think initially, at least at first blush, I have some concerns with, and I'm not sure. Frankly, I just don't know how to remedy that. But anyway.
So
Hey, Shane.
I was just going to say, Kevin, and Shane, I know this is something that we've commented on, is that 1,000-foot depth, and I'm wondering if DLCD is revisiting that.
So just kind of big picture, you know, you may know we're moving into work groups to discuss, you know, these different topic areas over the next few weeks. This will be one of the things that we'll be talking about, certainly. And just for those who don't know, I didn't mention this in my presentation, but there are some minimum dimensional standards for climate friendly areas. I believe it's 1,000 feet is the minimum dimension for a CFA for a larger city, and then it scales down for the smallest cities.
I think what might help us in some of those discussions, Shane, if you're willing to give us a sketch, and nothing that would be binding or anything at this point, but like where you might think a CFA would be, and then we can start looking like, oh yeah, I see what you're saying, because it's a lot easier to see a very specific example. So if you're willing.
Sure. Yep, I can work on that.
Mike, did you want to jump in on this issue?
I do, and believe me, this is a land use issue, so I don't have a lot of standing on how these rules work, but I have a question anyway. Assuming a city does designate these climate-friendly areas in various places, how do they then prevent things like gentrification and displacement? So if where you're designating an area, you're saying there's going to be higher density, we're going to expect a lot of redevelopment, but the existing population is there, might be in low income single family homes that they don't want to leave, they want to pass along or about the rest of their lives in that area. How are we supposed to, and this is also tied to the equity issues. Isn't there a concern that the cities will be kind of in a dilemma by saying we're supposed to develop higher density walkout communities, but will we be manufacturing gentrification in the areas we want to redevelop?
Yes, there is that concern, and that's why we have sort of this two-step process where the first step is really just, okay, let's decide which areas we're looking at as climate-friendly areas. And at the same time, let's do an analysis of equitable housing incomes to anticipate, or unequitable housing outcomes that could occur here, to anticipate displacement that might occur. The department has commissioned some work by faculty at Portland State University, and they have developed an anti-displacement, anti-gentrification toolkit with some great kind of spatial analysis tools, and also a number of measures that local governments can use to avoid displacement. But yeah, that's a question that we really want local governments to think about before they actually zone these areas, because we don't want those negative impacts to occur.
Hey, Kevin, has some of these numbers are, I mean, it's pretty high density. And I was wondering if you guys have considered whether the markets in any of the cities are actually at the point outside of Portland, probably, that they would support building to that sort of density in the next 5 years, or when that tipping point might happen, that this might actually be realized on the ground.
It's a great question. And, we've heard that from a number of people that, our market, here in my local community, we're not seeing this get built right now. We understand that. We are frankly trying to move the market to a degree here to get the kind of development we need to see for the equitable and, climate pollution reductions that we need to see. So they're aspirational to a degree. Basically, the thrust here is to free up the market to respond, and it will respond differently. But we are hoping that over time, people start to see that, hey, this works, this makes sense. And I think another thing that will help is pairing this with the parking management provisions that would apply within climate-friendly areas, because we know on-site parking requirements can significantly contribute to the cost of development, residential development, commercial development, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, we know that the markets may not be producing this level of development currently. We are trying to move the needle and free up the market to allow that to occur. And we're hopeful that over time we start to see that happen.
Following up on that, Kevin, I know we've talked about this before. I'm just wondering if there's been further consideration about having kind of a tiered approach to the density, kind of similar to the height, because we know our downtown, for example, in Salem, right, probably can support a higher density, but as you kind of move out of the downtown, we want to make those part of a climate-friendly area, you know, that 30 units per acre. Is there any consideration for kind of creating a lower tier, kind of like the 60-foot lower tier?
That's a good question, Eunice. You know, I would say that possibility is available through the outcome-oriented standard approach, you know, as proposed, that you might be able to say, hey, this package of development regulations in this area is going to achieve the level of development we need to see overall, even if some portions of it may not. But I will also say, I think we're open to proposals if there are some specific kind of idea for how you might buffer, if you're concerned about like creating buffers between more intensive and less intensive areas and some transition zones. That's something that we're open to. I can't say right now that we're developing it, but if that's an issue that comes up in the work groups, for example, I think we can spend some time on that. Other questions?
Might be good to move to the parking at this point.
Okay, sounds good.
Always good to move to parking. So parking reform, really quick overview. Why? Parking takes up a lot of land. It's a huge land use, up to like 20% of a city's land, both the on-street and off-street, particularly an intensive use in downtowns where we're trying to make it more walkable. Next slide. A lot of what we build is unused, and this is repeated again and again across developments, is we're just seeing we've got a lot of waste in the system. Next slide. Parking crowds out other things that we value. This is an example of Eugene's code requiring 1 space per unit. And that means instead of a 4-plex with 3 parking spaces, they could only afford, they could only make a duplex pencil. So we're trading, because we're requiring a bunch of parking, it means less housing units. Next slide. And finally, it causes people to drive more. As much as we think that driving is a static commodity, it actually responds to market signals about how easy it is to park. And so there's a lot of academic literature coming out just demonstrating that it actually does make a difference on what's happening on the ground. Next slide. So we've developed a kind of 3-step parking approach. Parking reform approach. Parking reform is happening all over the world. We're getting on that bandwagon, and it's happening all over Oregon as well, I would say. The parking code is drafted, has a set of best practices from parking codes across Oregon and elsewhere. Just how to count parking spaces, kind of credits people would get for installing car share and EV charging and that sort of thing. addressing really big parking lots and asking for some street trees or solar power if folks have very large parking lots, that sort of thing. The core of it, though, is giving cities and counties and UGBs kind of 3 core options on parking. The first is to do what a lot of cities are doing worldwide and just repeal parking mandates. This is just happening and just letting the market decide, because parking is a pretty diverse demand, and developers are pretty good at figuring out their business model and providing a certain amount of parking. And that's what we've seen in cities that have deregulated parking is a real diversity in terms of some places have a lot of parking, other places don't have parking, other places have lower parking than previously mandated. The second approach is to say, hey, in those areas where we know traditionally there's less need for driving, we're going to reduce the parking mandates there. And that's in the climate friendly areas and along the priority transit corridors, the most frequent transit corridors. So that's another option for cities to do. And if they do that, we're also asking them to adopt a set of fair parking policies. Sorry, I would say in both options 2 and 3, they reduce parking in those areas. In option 2, they do things like unbundling, which is renting parking spaces separate from residential units, or parking cash out, where people who don't drive to work get paid for not using a parking space, that sort of thing. And option 3, if cities don't adopt those policies, and I know land use planners aren't necessarily used to this sort of policy tools, is to, on top of the climate friendly areas and transit areas, is to really look at a bunch of development that may be hindered by parking requirements and scale out parking requirements. Things like historic properties, small businesses, and kind of larger areas, other things like schools and bars and things that they can kind of figure out for themselves how much parking they need. So that's kind of the three-part approach that we're offering. And lastly, there are some provisions for the most populous communities. In this region, it's just Salem, and we've been in touch and getting some feedback about some things that we're asking larger communities to do, or more populous communities to do. And we'll hopefully continue those conversations. Next slide. So again, this is the sort of type, sorry, long day. So the areas, I talked about the areas that would be impacted, the second part of this slide already, the transit corridors and the climate friendly areas. The other thing is saying, hey, there are some types that just consume less parking. Micro units, affordable housing, providing some flexibility. 60% of households that don't have cars are in the bottom 20% of income. So there's a lot less car consumption there. And then capping multifamily parking minimums at 1 space per unit. And that kind of brings forward some of the stuff 2001 and expands it out to all multifamily. Next slide. So the last thing that's tucked into the parking rules as are, is electric vehicle charging. We as a state are really working to prepare for the fleet. And right now we're in a chicken and egg situation where people aren't buying cars because they're not sufficient charging, and people aren't installing charging because there aren't sufficient cars. So we're hoping to nudge that along and to build for the future that we want. Oregon has a goal of having 90% of all new vehicles to be EVs by 2035. So that's a pretty aggressive goal. And that would mean about half the fleet by then would be that. So what we're saying is, as you're building new building, put in the conduit so charging can happen in the future. And this kind of builds on a bill the state legislature passed, but it's more aggressive. And it's just saying, hey, let's put in some pipes, be ready. It's not saying put in the wiring. It's not saying putting in the charging stations, but it is getting it ready. The other thing it does, as drafted, it's saying, hey, we actually have to have the electrical service capacity to serve 20% of spaces. So we need to get in those meters and the transformers to be ready for it. And this is just this week threw in a provision that say, hey, if people are providing these direct current fast chargers, they can do less because those are super fast to charge cars, and cars can hot swap that parking space, and it should be fine. Finally, there is a retrofit requirement for the most populous cities. Again, in this, saying, hey, when you're doing major retrofits, you have to bring it up to these codes unless it's super expensive. Costs more than 20% of the retrofit. So that's kind of a brief overview of what we're hoping to do on parking as it's drafted now. I think that's my last slide.
So again, we'll open the floor for any feedback or any questions on it. And of course, I'm always interested to know if cities have already had a chance to look at your existing code and figure out how much difference there is, or if you're already all along this path.
Can you remind me what the additional requirement is on Salem relating to that parking management that is not, that's required in any case?
Yeah, there are a few things that kick in. One is setting some parking maximums. One is I'm losing my thread. And the most significant one for the city of Salem, for the 3 cities in the state that are over 150,000, is saying you have to price some of your on-street parking. If you're going to mandate more parking, you have to price a small percentage of your on-street parking at a way that creates an actual price signal for people who are consuming it.
What I was trying to get at was that there was some, and I just don't remember the reference that were required. Say we got rid of all of our required parking requirements. I thought there was still some things that were going to be that larger cities had to do.
Yeah.
Was that the study every 3 years?
Yeah. So thank you, Julie. Yeah, there are 4 provisions right now, and I'm hearing some pushback on them, and so they may not survive the editing process. But the first is to adjust prices in areas that are priced every 3 years, and that language may have shifted to regularly or something. Anyway, I'm aware that 3 years may be over prescriptive. The other things are to try different things before building new parking garages, and to ask developers of parking garages to make the first floor retrofittable at a reasonable cost. So those are the provisions that would come in if, despite parking if you had no parking mandates.
I mean, I don't know what exactly we are going to do. It's really more in our planning department's hands for off-street parking requirements. But if I were making recommendation, I'd say just get rid of them, because there's a huge workload that's being, required to in my mind.
Well, I'm sure that goes in the notes of the meeting that Salem is going to repeal all of their parking mandates.
Yeah, thanks.
Tell us.
I seem to remember thinking that if you don't, you still have to repeal them within a half a mile of all high frequency transit corridors, and maybe within a half a mile of all climate friendly areas. I don't have it memorized, but my general sense was that you would basically be covering 3/4 of the city, if you went the other route.
Yeah, and certainly. Certainly that's it's somewhat dependent on people's transit services. So places that have decent transit service, it covers more of the city. If it's 15-minute headways or better, it covers it in the current draft. So you're right, within a half mile of those. So I am interested in that thing you said, a huge workload to kind of do the analysis and apply it. Is that what you're talking about, or are you talking about some?
Yeah, I mean, just to apply it, figure out the little nuances, do the public outreach on it, And, and it also seems a little disingenuous to go out to the public and ask them what you want them to do. And they say, we want parking requirements. And you say, oh, sorry, that's the one thing we can't do. I'm just hearing what we hear in neighborhood groups, and maybe this is what you guys are trying to fight against, but anyway, I see Lisa turned on her camera and she might have some smarter opinions on parking than I do.
I don't know if they're smarter. I was just going to say, Julie hears me say that every time when I'm like, the easiest from the staff perspective is just say no parking requirements and, delete the chapter and move on with life. Just thinking about the workload for, the rest of the rules and the work that we're doing. But, Salem is slowly, maybe quickly, recently moving towards parking reductions, right? We don't require parking for multifamily downtown or any along any of our major streets that are served by transit. We don't require parking for basically any use downtown. Probably on Monday night, the council is going to say no parking for middle housing. We have pretty low parking for multifamily. Planning Commission's recommending to make it even lower in areas that aren't downtown or near the core network. So, we don't require for homeless shelters and all these different things. So we have maximums. We have bonuses for, covered bike parking and shared cars and all these things. So it's in line with what Salem's doing. When I look at the list, I think some of the things in the second and third path or whatever you're calling them might achieve more than just saying you don't have to have parking, because it might shift the environment quicker to do some of those things than just saying you don't have to provide parking, because a lot of developers will still just provide the parking that they think the market wants. We'll just be applying maximums to them. So that from a wanting to be a good planner perspective, I look at the second or third path and think that might have a better public benefit overall for Salem. But then the kind of workload aspect, and I think just get rid of them.
Yeah, and I definitely as a parking walk want everyone to take the second path because the price signals are more getting us where we're going, but we don't have the authority to require people to do that. So
nothing that says you couldn't do both. You could eliminate all parking mandates and put price signals on. I won't stop you.
Yeah, great. I'm not the one that decides about priced parking, so I'll let someone else at the city, and I will support them in that effort.
I was just going to say,
yeah,
that's a different department. So, go ahead.
There is a goal, I think, at the city, some portion of the city council to introduce paid parking in our downtown. We've done it all around. We've ringed it downtown with paid parking, but downtown not currently there. So.
And I was just going to say that one of the, if we do go down that path, one of the things, and this is just a picky thing, but I think it talks about a certain percentage of all on-street parking needs to be charged at a certain level or whatever. And so I'm thinking to myself, okay, on-street parking throughout the city of Salem, we don't mark spaces. So we have no inventory of all of the on-street parking in the city of Salem. What is that? Because, do you assume every curb frontage? Do you take out driveways? Do you take out fire hydrants? We don't have an inventory of that. So I don't know how we'd come up with what is, it was 5 or 10% or something like that. Anyway, that was another part of the work effort that I would think would dissuade us from wanting to go down that route.
Yeah, and this has come up in some of my conversations with our communities, and I kind of said, hey, in guidance, we would be kind of clear on how close you would have to get, like the levels of precisions we would expect on that math wouldn't be super high. It's also something I've seen a lot of grad students take on as projects. The GIS folks kind of love that sort of puzzle, but not to add, but a close approximation is probably fine per, So I know that's not written in the rules, but that's something that we're aware of in guidance, that people don't know how much parking they have, and yet they're mandating a bunch more. And so that's kind of the puzzle we're trying to get to.
I want to give Shane a chance here, and then we do need to probably move on after that.
Sure, I'll just really quick, just have kind of two comments. One, you all have been at this, I think, pretty much longer than me. So is there any way that when I get to dealing with parking, it sounds like Lisa's Planning Commission and Council might be a lot easier for me to get those changes adopted through them rather than Keizer. Sorry,
We'll adjust the rules.
We've tried to reduce parking multiple times. We've had limited success with that. I would say my opinion is that I agree with Lisa strictly from a workload and a streamline point of view. Eliminating them would be the easiest path forward for a place like Keizer. The one kind of question I have for the state is I've actually dealt with developers more often than not building enough parking that they want to build. Like, our code doesn't allow them to exceed 150% of what we require as a minimum. So I've had several commercial developers that want to argue that and go actually more and more because they say that's what they need. So if we just eliminate parking mandates altogether, the concern I guess I have is that it could actually work against us in that you could have developers coming into a community like Keizer, which is a suburb, and there's not great transit service here right now. And so they come in and they build, and then they overbuild the parking. I guess the suggestion from you guys be to then you don't have a minimum, but you still have a maximum. And what would you base that on?
Yeah, there are provisions for maximums for communities over 100,000 in the draft rules, and they're tricky, to be clear. So it's not a super restrictive parking maximum that we put in there. You know, I would look at just comparable developments and figure out.
Keizer's only like 40,000 people, so
yeah, the current draft is not applying to you. So if you're saying that we should apply it to you, that's interesting feedback.
There's nothing in the rule that
I'm not necessarily saying that, but I guess that's just the thought that I have is that, you know, that just simply eliminating the mandate may not actually achieve that outcome of getting people out of cars necessarily. So anyway.
But there's nothing in the rule that would require Keizer to eliminate those maximums.
Okay.
Keep the maximums. Just eliminate the minimum.
Sure.
But they're tied to his minimums, right? So I mean, I guess
so recalculate them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. I'll let other people talk. I reach out to me, talk to me about parking. That's what I always say. It's what I dream of. Sometimes have nightmares about, but usually positive dreams, and would love to adjust them to meet folks' needs.
Okay, well, I'm back again to talk about the transportation planning rules. I'm going to try to summarize this in 3 slides, so we'll have lots of time to talk about it. So for 30 years, DLCD's had the Transportation Planning Rules, Division 12, to basically guide cities and counties how to do integrated land use and transportation planning. We know that, you know, looking at the slides that Evan showed us, where we're at today, we're not meeting our climate or equity goals, and we need to really change the way we're doing business. The good news is we have a lot of good work to build on, and so we're not radically redoing how you do transportation planning in the state. We're really just kind of, as Bill would say, turning up the volume on what we're doing. And so, next slide, Matt. The rules have a really increased focus on pedestrian planning, bicycle planning, public transportation. I will say that if you look in the draft rule packet, you'll find these modal elements, and they're in rules 500 through 800. And those really just have each chapter of a TSP should have, well, you already have this, you know, a pedestrian element, a bicycle element, public transportation element. And so this really just kind of has a discrete set of rules for how you do the planning for each. And it really starts with, you know, gathering the inventory data, what's out there, envisioning what the full build out of a system needs to be, and coming up with different project lists for each modal element. So each, bicycle, pedestrian, public transit, transportation options will have kind of, these are the projects we envision needing for each of these modes. And then those kind of come together into the project lists requirement. But really the focus here is on, building a really connected, safe, complete networks. We've done a really good job of building out our automotive system. You can get to anywhere you need to go. It's really safe. It's really convenient, but not so much on bike or ped. We have a lot of system gaps, and transportation options and public transportation need a lot more investment as well. The real focus of the rules is to, we've heard this over and over again, is to take bite-sized chunks. So really look at climate-friendly areas. That designation is really the driving force to kind of prioritize work there. We know that these are areas that are existing now or in the future, and we want to make sure that you can really get around your daily needs without needing a car. And so there's some increased focus on getting multimodal solutions kind of focused in on there. And also for neighborhoods with underserved populations, we want to make sure that we are, a lot of people don't drive by choice, but by necessity. And so we want to make sure that we are doing some investments in areas where people maybe not be able to drive. The rules also kind of point out access to key destinations. So where are the places that people need to go by car, by foot, or by wheel? So the next slide, please, Matt. I know I'm going this really fast and high level here, but the rules in probably starting in 155 through 210 say how to take those modal element lists and put them together and come up with an illustrative project list. And then how to make the selections between competing projects, and results in, this is the big wish list that we have. We don't have enough money to cover it, but we know these are the projects that, out of our planning work that we need to do. That list needs to reach a VMT reduction target that's based on the greenhouse gas reduction targets. We want to look at, a financially constrained list that hasn't been in the TPR, but most newer TSPs are looking at, what can we actually afford to build, and let's kind of prioritize things. So more and more, this work is just happening, and we're saying we want to make sure that we introduce a budget here and get a TSP that has a financially constrained list. The rules in 0160 say that list, the financially constrained list, needs to reduce VMT, not by any target, but just needs to show an overall reduction. Then we get to, there's your project list. So there's a number of other rules in there. I don't think I have time to go through them, and it might be more helpful just to kind of open up the floor to questions here.
Thanks. And this is another one where I'd be curious to hear from the local staff is, how well do you think you've got good inventories on these systems already that we've been talking about? And you have some standards that already require building for those? Or is there going to be there's a big step here? And anything else that's on your mind?
We have pretty terrible inventory information. And so we are finally, hopefully, fingers crossed, actively working to address that. We are looking at using some LiDAR data collection to bring things, to go out in the field and collect a lot of data to build a new asset management system for our transportation. Now, that's probably going to take a couple of years, I would assume. I mean, I've been promised for 20 years that we are going to have our transportation assets available in GIS, and that hasn't happened yet, but there is a lot of energy for it right now. So yeah, so in that sense, it's a stretch. I guess I sort of not answering that question specifically, but one of the things that I've struggled with in this is that, you talk about the illustrative list needing to meet your VMT reduction target and your included list needing to reduce VMT per capita. And going back to the whole tool issue, what's the tool that's going to tell us whether or not we are meeting those targets? Are we looking to SCATs to run our illustrative project list through the regional travel demand model that is not sensitive to these things? I mean, I don't think we can. Or are we just saying if our illustrative project list results in X miles of protected bike facilities, Y miles of pedestrian facilities, then we can assume we have met our VMT reduction target. The way it's written reads as if there's this box I can just plug my projects into and it will spit out an answer. And if I get the wrong answer, I can just substitute one project for another and spit out and get a different answer. And, but in my world, that doesn't exist.
Yeah, and we're working closely with ODOT, and we recognize the need for the tools to be updated to support the rules that we're putting out there. And so we are, planning on putting considerable effort into getting, whether it's post-processor or an update to a modeling tool. But we realize that we're going to need to bring our tools up to the 21st century on a lot of this stuff, because they were, frankly, some of them were built for a different purpose. And that was to plan for automotive, system capacity.
So if the tools aren't available, then we don't have to do it.
I think that we expect the tools to be available.
So I would hope that in the rules somehow it's written using the best available tools or something that acknowledges that this is probably going to be an evolving process, and we may be,
I think that we're intentionally a little bit vague there because we don't want to paint ourselves in a corner and have, this is a tool you must use.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
It's just that right now, the way it's written, it just sounds like there is a tool.
Yeah.
And I don't think there is a tool. And I don't think, so I just think it needs to be written in a way that's clear. And I'm thinking about things like, okay, we take our TSP to get adopted and somebody decides to take us to court because it doesn't meet one of these things. What's the bar we're trying to reach? And I don't know the answer to it. It makes me feel very stupid.
Well, that's a good comment, and thank you. We'll, continue working on that. We've been meeting with Mike and Ray and talk, with ODOT and the Oregon Model Steering Committee's got an action item on, getting these things sorted out. So you're not stupid. You're just like, we're all.
We don't even feel like that, Julie. No.
Yeah. We're all figuring it out.
Thanks for the comment.
Let's just put the cards on the table. We've been doing modeling for many, many years in Salem. We think we have an adequate model for the kind of questions we're asked, but not all questions. And so while we have a mode choice model that in theory says if you do certain things, more people will switch to transit or bike walk, it doesn't always come out in ways that are expected, or people assume there'll be a lot more walking in transit if we put these things in. So, I don't know if we can promise you here today or the staff level that we'll have these tools done by 3 years or 5 years. I just don't know. No one does this really well, to be very honest. No one does this really well. The tools were kind of built, as Cody said, for automobile and transit. Those are the two main modes it was built for. And doing the walking and biking is just not, you think just throw it in. Someone just said, throw it in, change your tool. And God willing, I would like to sit back to them, okay, just put a big propeller on your car and make it a flying car. Simple as that. People have really simple answers when they don't know what they're talking about and they don't do modeling. So I just want to put that card on the table that I'm glad the rule is vague, and I understand what Julie's saying, because we've been down in rules where say, hey, the rule says this, and my organization says City of Salem is not doing that, and therefore we're taking them to LUBA. So a little thought, maybe a little additional thought may be useful to see if these rules are not going to paint us in that corner. And when I say us, I mean Salem and Keizer, because they're not going to sue the MPO.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Well, I know I dusted a lot of stuff under the rug there in that summary. So there's a lot more rules here to talk about. Equitable engagement, equity analysis, the VMT increasing facilitation process. And I can't promise to have answers for any of these, but.
So I have a question. It's sort of another one that I feel stupid when I ask. I mean, I've been doing this long enough that, sometimes I'm like, God, I really should know the answer to this, but then I just can't think of it. So if I remember correctly, reading the draft rules, it talks about, your TSP needs, if you're doing a major update, you're doing it for a 20-year time horizon, a minimum of 20 years, I believe, which aligns with the what the requirements for RTSPs. And then it says that you must use your adopted, acknowledged comprehensive plan land use assumptions. So looking forward to, the city working on an update to the TSP, while our comprehensive plan that we're working on right now, our Salem plan, goes through 2035. So in 2 years, if we're working on adoption of a TSP and our comp plan only goes to 2035, how do we go beyond that? I guess is sort of one question, because we don't have something adopted and acknowledged beyond that. And then the second one is a little bit more tricky in my mind, which is if the TSP says, hey, we're looking at the transportation system and we need to incorporate more land use, multimodal, mixed use, whatever, into our land use in order to meet our transportation goals, but we can't do that because we're tied to our adopted comp plan designations. So that chicken and egg issue is, I'm not sure how that gets addressed.
I know that the timing issues with the horizon year of the comp plans and TSPs is, you're not alone. That's happening everywhere. The horizon years, planning, it's the worst. It's like the units and the years never match up the way you want them to. It's I think we could talk offline about some options there, but that is something that, ODOT, supports the modeling, and I'm sure Ray and Mike could talk to that as well. I think for the second part of your question is that the performance monitoring system that we talked about in the rules 900 of the TPR, that really kind of like, hey, we did this, but whoops, there's a gap. Then you go back and you address that gap, right? And so that's kind of the good ongoing process piece of these rules, in my opinion, is that we know we're not going to get it right the first time, right? This isn't like, we don't expect anyone just to like figure it all out. There, you might take a chunk and say, we adopted the comp plan amendment, say, and then we did some planning and found out that, hey, we need to do more to get to our goals, right? And so then you propose that we need to go back and adopt a little bit more of the multimodal land use pattern, and then you have time to go back and do that. I don't know if I understood your question right. Are you puzzled by my response?
I'm just trying to think through it. And part of it is just, I'm thinking through the findings, so you're doing findings that you're meeting all these requirements, but you're not meeting them. And you're, I don't know, not quite sure the right answer. And on the population thing, I'm not sorry, the population, the out year, the horizon year issue, maybe there's a way to build some flexibility into the rule so that, because right now it's sort of very specific. And I know one of the things when I looked at the going regionally versus going, into jurisdictions not deciding not to go regionally, somewhere in there it talked about all the jurisdictions need to have the same out year for their transportation plans. And, I can't even imagine that happening. I can't imagine a world in which that happens because we have a hard enough time with our comp plans and our TSPs and then the regional plan. So that's one reason I think going regionally makes more sense, but I also think maybe there needs more flexibility in those horizon years.
Okay.
Well, I'd just like to say, I appreciate that you're putting in the requirement for the local TSPs to be financially constrained. So hopefully by the time they bring their financially constrained plan project demands requests to the MPO, it will all be done for me and my workload will be reduced, which is good. And then, what Julie just said, it would be even better if you would have them align their years with ours, or, have Shane and Julie align their out years so we're all consistent. But of course, that won't ever work. But it would be nice to get it closer because, currently we have Keizer, who has a TSP from 2009. Turner's from 1999. Salem's is 2014-ish. I don't remember. And they all have different out years, even if there's trying to feed products to the MPO. So not that it will probably be addressed in this TPR update, but.
Hey, I'm down. If somebody wants to pay for it and give me a consultant to do the work, I'll have it be whatever year you guys want. I'm okay with it.
Shane, can you do Salem's TSP while you're at it?
No.
I
Consultant.
see the exchange coming here. He'll do both TSPs, but you have to adopt the parking regulations for both cities then.
Right.
Called regional collaboration.
Oh, man. Well, hey, you guys, I apologize. I have a planning commission meeting at 6, so I probably actually have to sort of like set up the room and maybe get ready for it. So I'm going to have to run. I am not a transportation planner at all. Unfortunately, I wear the planning director hat, so some of those responsibilities fall to me. So, when we're talking TSPs, I was around sort of the last time we went through a TSP update, but it was a very minimal level. So I don't feel that I really have a ton to offer. However, I would echo some of the things that Julie said, and especially what Mike and Ray say, because I know they know what they're talking about. But I would just say the one thing that I do kind of still have some confusion on, and I think Julie kind of spoke to it. Obviously, our TSP is driven by, levels of service that are being provided, and that kind of drives what's needed. I know in our rulemaking advisory committees, there was talk, and there's been quite a bit of discussion about other metrics to measure things like amount of, bicycle lanes built and sidewalks and things like that. I don't know if there was anything that kind of landed on, and I think this is kind of what Julie was saying. I don't know if there was anything, I can't remember if there's anything that really spells out how much is enough if you're using those types of metrics to justify, okay, these projects, they're not doing anything for traffic, but they're doing things for bike and ped. Like what the bar is that a city needs to get to. And so that would be something that just, as I'm heading out of my office, that was one of the things that I did when Julie was talking about that. I kind of would want to echo that a little bit from our end, because, I don't think in Keizer, we're going to have a whole lot of big changes to any future TSP update, because there's not a lot of things identified right now. There's a handful of things, but I don't think we're going to be adding a ton of roadway. But I do know that from a community base, we want to see better ped facilities. We want to see better bike facilities. We recognize that that's needed for our neighborhoods and the surrounding areas around our commercial core. So I think having some guidance on, what's going to get us to where we need to be that isn't necessarily driven by those other metrics, that would be helpful too. So anyway, and with that, I do apologize, but I got to go. So thank you so much for the meeting. And
Thanks for
Julie,
being
fill
here.
me in on what happens in the rest of it.
So Shane, I put up a quick slide just so that you know what the future is coming for this, but you've probably seen some of this already.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Shane,
Yeah.
are you guys meeting in person?
Yes, we are.
Wow.
We're Keizer, we're a little different here. So, we wear masks, we stay separated, but everything's in person with our committees.
Sort of nice.
It is, although, man, the Zoom was sort of nice because I could go home and do my meeting from my bedroom, and that was nicer because I could wear sweats. So, Anyway, all right, we'll see you guys later. Thank you.
Shane.
Thank you guys for hosting.
Well, I will just say a brief on this slide here, and then we can go back to some more of the interesting discussion. I'll take the slides off, but things coming up, working towards a rule advisory committee meeting here in December. So we're going to be sending out a packet to that very soon. And then coming along in January, we will have another version of the rule. So think of this as a snapshot coming out here. It's a constantly evolving. And there will also be some impact statements that we put together with this rule to talk about what kind of fiscal impact you would have on small businesses, on homeowners, and a new idea, or home building, I'm sorry, not homeowners, a racial impact statement, which is something we've not done in the past, but we will be trying it out for this rule. And then LCDC, our commission, will be having meetings to look at it on February. Will be another update and maybe some direction from them. And then the actual hearing would be March and April, and then adoption there in May. So any questions on that? Oh, and Kevin put into the chat a link for a survey following up from this meeting. So please do, if you have a chance, follow that link. Give us your thoughts. And I got those details out of the way. We can go back to the actual interesting discussion with the questions and comments.
I have one more unless somebody else wants to jump in.
I think we gave him a decent interval. Go ahead, Julie.
On the capacity increasing project section of the rule, I think we've provided some comments. I think others have as well in terms of, I guess, a definition of what you mean by capacity increasing. So, taken to an extreme, upgrading our signal controllers can increase capacity. Adding a turn lane that is mainly for safety purposes also adds capacity. I think that Springfield has mentioned roundabouts would add capacity. And so the way it's worded right now, it implies that any project that would increase capacity 1 iota would need to go through essentially a NEPA light process, which is pretty, in my mind, involved and expensive. And have you guys heard that feedback? Do you have any reactions to that? Any responses to maybe a better or actually defining what you mean?
I think that we have heard that, that just need more specificity on some of that, that it's a little bit broad right now, as you say. So I think that is on the list for us to look at as far as like what defines a capacity increase. And yeah.
And I know that for I'm going to put Ray and Mike on the spot here, but we already have a requirement at the regional level to do the congestion management process where we have to do, we have to look at other things before increasing capacity. The definition there is that capacity is anything more than a certain distance of general purpose travel lane. So it excludes a lot of things like signals, turn pockets, maybe some other stuff, but and the process that's required or is a lot simpler. I mean, it basically is that, you have to go through and you have to say, have we looked at, using transportation system management? Have we looked at, these other things and certify that we have done it? But anyway, Ray and Mike, did I get that right?
You want to send a link or something to us so we can take a look at that?
Yeah, I can send you a link. And it's also this is a part of the federal regulations under 450.500. So 23, well, I'll send you a link. And we just arbitrarily defined what the length was at some point. And as we're redoing the CMP, it is something that we're relooking is currently it's a half mile. Is that too short? Is that too long? We don't get a lot of projects that meet criteria. But I think if you guys can look at it and see if it aligns well with what you're writing with the feds, and that might save some hassle, because it is very similar. It's like the feds want people to look at all the alternatives before you increase SOV capacity.
So is this for, I'm sorry, is this for areas that are not in air quality attainment, or is this for any MPO?
This is any TMA, and then and then anybody that has air quality maintenance, you have to do the documentation and do a little bit more. But yeah, I'll send you a link, Cody.
Thank you.
It would also be interesting if you said there's not been very many projects that qualified. If you had a quick list handy somewhere, I don't want to make you comb through your records, but if it's available.
No, it's like 7 over the last 2 decades. So we started this in 2003. I-5 is the big one. Salem, Kubler. That's about it. Everything else that has been done is pretty much intersection based, or it's addressing a bottleneck. And the feds allow us, if it's addressing a bottleneck or safety issue, then you don't really have to go through the CMP. So,
and certainly we want to have an exemption that covers for safety issues, when you're doing something that is safety. And I would think that even like traffic signalization or traffic signal optimization, if I can get that proper,
right,
should be exempted.
Channelization, and the state had a long list from when they from the 90s that we sort of, it's the stuff that makes sense.
Well, access management,
lines.
Putting in a median to restrict turns across it increases capacity. It also improves safety. It also does a lot of other things, but would we want this, so I'm looking at it I'm just looking at it from reality. We really do not have that many projects that add general purpose travel lanes. The only things I can think of are, Horton Kubler, the rest of that corridor is planned as a major arterial serving the whole Mill Creek Corporate Center and things like that. So that's one. That's pretty much the only one that jumps out to me.
That's about
maybe someday the very south end of Commercial Street.
Yeah, there's one section where it necks down to, it's planned for 5 lanes, and there's one section between Fabry, I think, and Wiltsey and Madras.
And even in Keizer, I think, like Lock Haven Drive, they added a turn lane at 14th just because it was just, backed up for its whole length. But it's, it's one of those small projects that get rid of a bottleneck. 12th Street was like that. So, in the 28 years, there hasn't been that many capacity increasing projects. There's so few you can kind of count it on 2 hands.
That's a very helpful message for us to hear, and to have that list. People say, look, they're not happening that often. And
you can count on 2 hands, and half of them are ODOT facilities. So
I was gonna say, are we counting state projects, or are you counting just city projects here?
I would say, but state and city. Really, there aren't that many. Most of our funds, and I say this to everyone, and they just don't seem to get it. The majority of our projects are urban upgrades to put in sidewalks and bike lanes or safety crossings, with the occasional, intersection upgrades. That's it in Salem Keizer. That's the majority of projects, with very few adding capacity. So, like Julie said, we're trying to do more with what we have. So we're upgrading signals that are, either not there or really out of date, or our signal interconnects, and of course transit. So, that's our emphasis areas.
I'll just put a little asterisk.
I like the idea, Matt, of you saying that we could do something that says where we're trying to improve system efficiency, signal optimization, that's allowable. And then I don't know what section this is in, because I have an old version of the TPR. I have the one from October or before.
The RAC 9 version, it's 0830.
Okay.
And it's on page 133 of that RAC 9 packet.
Yep, I have the old version. It just says draft will be available in October. So I guess I have to print out a new version for myself.
Ray was trying to say something.
Well, I was going to say that the asterisk is, the new roads, Lone Oak, Mildred, whatever it's called down south, that's not part of the CMP, but that would be new capacity. So it wouldn't come under our problem area so much as what you guys would need, probably, depending on how you define new roads to serve development.
Yeah, and that's one of my, and if there's some that we have to go through an extra process on, and to make the case that this is needed, okay, that's fine, as long as the process isn't, a NEPA light. I'm thinking about, so South Salem, Matt, you live somewhere in South Salem. I don't know if you live this far out, but
I do.
And connectivity and having, options for people. So Mildred and it turns to Fabry is is a minor arterial in our plan. Minor arterial is intended to be one travel lane each direction with a, turn pockets or a center turn lane. And we have a plan to extend that from where it currently ends near Pringle Elementary School out to Battle Creek Road. So, is that, I think we can make the argument that we
You
need
say
to
it's a
have
minor
this-
arterial?
It's a minor arterial, yeah. And I think your rule exempted collectors. We did, the difference in our.
Well, that could be an interesting case study. If you, again, send in, just a little map or a sketch that shows that area, and then we'll do to try to kind of run it through that process and go like, okay, well, where would this process lead you?
Right, and so
I find it's a lot easier to talk about these with a specific example in mind rather than kind of trying to like, an arterial.
Big bad arterial, yeah. Yeah, I can definitely, send in an example. So for me, like I said, if it's 5 projects that we need to work through this extra process, fine. If it's 25 projects, because it includes intersection turn lanes that we may be, anyway, then, that you're suddenly, the workload is just unreasonable. The other issue is, for me, is the TSDCs. So we have a project list for transportation system development charges. And so are we saying that, are we going to put into question money that we have been collecting and that we are collecting? Because it's based on a list that includes some capacity projects, and Kubler-Cordon is probably the easiest one. Most of ours are also not. When we talk about capacity, we're talking about multimodal capacity. Okay, it's not just cars. So, a project that brings a street up to an urban standard is capacity. I don't know
that we thought through the SDC connection, but that's a good one.
It has been raised at the RAC from, I think, some other jurisdiction as well.
Yeah. So I think the intent on this authorization process is you do it as part of the TSP. So then you do have a list of known. It's not like you're sort of saying, well, we put it in our TSP, but we will have to do an authorization process later and we don't know what that might show us. So hopefully you would have the list, but I see what you're saying. You have existing lists.
Yeah, and then depending on how far down it drills, we don't typically include, the TSP does not necessarily identify, we want a right turn lane at this intersection, because the TSP level of analysis is much higher, right? Sometimes there will have been a refinement study that will know that we need this here, but anyway.
So I have a question for you, Julie. So if you have a TSP on the books and you're collecting SDCs for these projects and you have this project list, and then you go and update your TSP, are you having to keep those projects in there, or can the community say, you know what, we don't want that project anymore? Is that, are you really stuck to those projects, or can you change your mind and say, no, we're going to do it a different way?
I think it would depend somewhat on the magnitude of the change. I know that we did have an issue this is probably 19, 20 years ago, where and this is just when I was starting at the city, we had a TSP that got amended that removed some projects, and the TSDC list did not get amended. And we didn't actually get sued, but we got threatened with a suit because we were collecting based on projects that were not in our TSP.
So it sounds like you have to amend the TSDC
DC
list
to
change it.
reflect, yes, to reflect the TSP. And so I don't know if there would be any sort of like go back and say, well, gosh, you're reflecting this based on, whatever. I don't know if that pushback would happen.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, I had a thought and I'm trying to remember what it was. Oh, well. Came and it went.
Well, that's what happens when we're working at 6 o'clock in the evening. So I think I would propose that we be wrapping up here. I hate to cut anybody off if someone has a burning comment that they want to share. There is a survey. Did I mention there's a survey available? So you can go fill out and send the information that way. But otherwise, I think I would want to thank you all. This is, to me, is a very productive way to work on the rules and to get some specific examples and to see how we can make amendments to the rules. So I certainly appreciate it. And I hope that you've had a chance among the region to talk about it and think about it. And I will put in a plug too to start thinking about what your work plan might be like as a region. I realize that the rules won't be adopted for a while, but that doesn't mean you can't start now talking among, cities, counties, MPO, about how you will approach these.
Yeah,
Thanks,
and
everyone.
we talk, sorry, I was to say we talk regularly. It's just that this is still too much up in the air and us not understanding it enough to get down to specifics.
So when it's final, you'll be ready. Echo Matt's thanks. Thank you, everybody, for staying late. And all your help in co-creating these. RAC members, everybody. Thanks, team.
Thank you.
Oh, good night.